Hello and welcome to the Financial Future Guide. I'm your guy and I'm your guide. My name is Alex and today we're analyzing a stock called TD Global Technology Leaders. Now this is something a little different than my usual analysis because TEC is actually an electronically traded fund known as an ETF. Now for those who don't know what an ETF is, an ETF is a fund available on exchanges that allows investors to buy multiple companies with a single share purchase. Picture it as buying a basket of companies. And for those who don't yet invest in ETFs, hear me out because I think this is a great addition to any portfolio, allowing you to dip your toes into a large range of growing tech companies. Global Technology Leaders Index ETF is listed on the TSX under ticker symbol TEC.TO. And real quick, before we begin, just double check that you're subscribed, and if not, click that button to help support our community. It only takes a few seconds and you can always change your mind at a later date. Without further delay, let's get right into it. TEC ETF is technology focused. It tracks another index which measures the return of global, mid, and large cap companies related to technology. Currently, tech makes up 67.2% of the portfolio. However, the true percentage would actually be higher as some of the tech companies in this ETF are placed in different classes. For example, Visa and MasterCard that are classified as a financial company. The ETF has a wide range of tech companies that include traditional technology companies, but also includes companies that are engaged in disruptive technologies. Disruptive technologies are anything that can disturb or significantly change an industry. An example of this would be Uber, in which they completely disrupted the taxi industry to the point where taxi drivers were throwing hands at Uber drivers in the streets. There are obviously pros and cons of disruptive technologies, but at the end of the day, people are switching to them for a reason, right? So companies and industries that aren't willing or able to adapt tend to get left behind. As suggested in TEC's name, they are focused on global technology leaders, but it is important to note that this is weighted towards the US, with 83.8% of the holdings being US companies. We can also see the European Union with 7.3%, Japan with just under 5%, and Canada with just a small 1.4%. So I just think it's important to note that TEC is weighted towards the United States quite heavily. But when we take a look at the companies that are inside it, you kind of understand why. And despite the fact that they are United States listings and United States companies, for the most of them, they have a very large international presence. So the last thing to note about this fund is they have 240 holdings. So that's 240 different companies that are found within the TEC fund. We're actually going to take a little deeper look at this one and head over to the TD website to check out the holdings and what companies are found within this fund. So taking a look at the full list of holdings, I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly, but I will leave the link in the description below so you can go and review these yourself. There are many important factors to consider when looking at ETFs, but at the end of the day, the companies that ETF is holding is by far the most important part for choosing your ETF to invest in. And what you'll notice as I go through these, many of these companies are, yes, in fact, American, but are operating on huge scales internationally. So number one here, we have Apple with 13.17%, Microsoft with 10.67%, Amazon with just under 9%. Facebook with 4.3%, Alphabet, commonly known as Google, combines their Class A and Class C shares for over 6%. We got Visa and MasterCard, Tesla even sneaks in there for a cheeky hello. We got Nvidia, Adobe, Intel, Salesforce, PayPal, Netflix, Cisco, Broadcom, Texas Instruments, Qualcomm, Oracle, Sony, and even Shopify comes in there, cheeky little Canadian saying hello. And the list goes on, and we get into some smaller companies, especially some from overseas. But you get the point. I definitely recommend coming on here, having a good old scroll. We even got Square down here with a 0.37%, but that's a great disruptive tech company in the payment sector. But all in all, this is a great group of companies that I definitely want to get a hold of. So taking a look over here at the stock quote today, you will notice this is slightly different to what it looks like when we look at an individual company, and there are a few metrics that are different. But first up, pretty standard, we're looking at the price today. They closed at $21.76, up 22 cents on the day, or 1.02%. We can see that the net assets, so the total amount of assets, the total holdings that the fund actually has, is 273.28 million. So right away you will notice this is on the smaller side of a fund, and that partly does have to do with the fact that it's fairly new. So next up we see the yield, which is 0.29%, and this is essentially just a dividend, but the ETF version. 0.29% is nothing to write home about, but if you're already investing in tech companies, you do understand that the majority of these companies do pay a dividend below 1%. We can see in the 52-week range, they've traded anywhere between $14.14 and $24.60 Canadian. And ETFs always have an expense ratio, which is 0.35% listed here, but what we're going to pay attention to is the MER, which is the management expense ratio, and this is what is listed on the TD website for this fund of 0.39%, and I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on exactly what this is in just a moment. And as I mentioned before, this is a fairly new fund. TD only recently gave birth to this one about mid last year, so that kind of explains why the net assets and the total size is not as big as we would typically see from an ETF at this time. So I was telling you nothing but the truth when I said that we would look at the management expense ratio in just a moment. So to break it down, it comes in three pieces. So the first chunk, and usually the largest, is the management fee, and this is just paying them for their time, the tools that they require to do their research, their service, and your ability to access it in the first place. Next up is just the operating costs, and this is things like filing fees, audits and legal fees, reports, accounting and fund valuations, all that fun stuff that just goes a part of their day-to-day expenses. And last but not avoidable is the taxes. Each fund is required to pay taxes on its management and administration fees, so that's just them pushing it down the line to you, saying, hey buddy, do you mind taking this one? Now taking a look at how the MER comes into play, an example here is if your fund returned 7% over the course of the year, and the MER was 1.89%, you would be left with a 5.11% gain for your reported investment performance. And speaking of performance, let's go and take a look at the performance of TEC over the last year. We can see that since the fund's inception on May 7th, 2019, so just over a year ago, the fund has returned 41.52%. So that does make the MER of 0.39% look fairly irrelevant when you're looking at the grand scheme of things. As we know, some of the large tech companies that are within this fund have performed extremely well during this pandemic, so it doesn't surprise me that this fund has seen a lot of return in the last year. I personally wouldn't count on seeing an amazing historical performance this quickly again, but I think overall, given what this fund is holding and the future outlook for these companies, we should see a fairly strong performance moving into the future. So that's going to wrap up what I wanted to talk about today. This really is my favorite technology ETF available on the Canadian exchange. There are some other options, but TEC is definitely my personal favorite just because the amount of companies within this fund that I would actually invest in individually. And in all honesty, the weightings are kind of similar as to what I would do if I did buy it individually. This has allowed me to keep it super simple, and I just keep putting money into TEC as I am a strong believer in the future outlook for many of these companies. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to see videos similar to this one.